Hi, everyone. It's Alyssa, and welcome to week 2 of our class content. I'll be uploading a presentation for you on Reconstruction shortly. But first, I want to do a review of what you went over in the first week of work to make sure that you have a chance to reflect on the key concepts and of the content, as well as thinking about the ways in which we're framing our discussion on the history of the United States in a post-Civil War era. But we begin at the top of our Moodle page. I have posted for you office hours where you can click on the Zoom link right there, and I will be available for any kind of questions or discussions you want to have about the content. If you can't meet those office hours, Tuesday 1 to 3, Wednesday noon to 1, or Thursday 1 to 2, please feel free to reach out and we can schedule a one-on-one time. So by now you've probably navigated through the discussion for week 1, and I've graded those. So take a look at your grade. If you didn't receive 20 points for your initial response, that's likely because you did not include direct references to any key concepts. Throughout this course, our weekly discussions are a very important part of your grade, and they're an important way for you to show me that you're actually applying the work and that you're reading through, you're processing, you're analyzing, and you're synthesizing the content that you're given. So it's important that you spend time thoughtfully reviewing that. And we'll go through later. I'll be posting as well for you some videos on the final projects. We will be meeting one-on-one to discuss your research topics. But right now, we're just getting our feet wet with everything. So, one thing is important to understand when we look at the past is to understand that we're coming from our own modern perspectives. You were asked to write a timeline, right? And in that timeline, include some important events over the course of the past year or so, and explain why you chose those events. Now, you'll be in week 2, including some of the highlights from your timeline and sharing them with one another. And what you're going to see is that we all have some threads that might be consistent, but we've all chosen something a little bit different. And it's because we're coming at it from our own perspective. I like to talk about the different lenses that we carry around and see the world through, because for us to contextualize the past in a fair and objective way, we have to be mindful of our own biases so that we can move past them and in our academic work, right? At least to a certain point, at least enough to be able to identify the biases and perspectives of others. Because if we can't do that, then we can never really historically analyze the past, because we can't see beyond our own experiences. So the first thing is to be mindful of our experiences. We all have these individual group identities, right? And they shape who we are. We're informed by our past, by our culture, by our family, by our friends, all of it. And it's important that we identify in these small groups in order to be able to fully become our individual selves. But they can also lead us to an us versus them mentality. I'm a woman of color. I am a Southerner, and you're going to get that in this class, right? I'm also a Saints fan. Who dat, right? No team's better than the Saints. And I'm sure some of you would agree with me because the Saints are awesome. But some of you might also disagree. Maybe you're a Pats fan or something, right? But if I am to say that my choice, my preferences are right and are most right, then there's something inherently wrong in what you choose if you choose something different from me. And the idea that I have the right to choose the Saints as my team, right? It's a little lighthearted one. But sometimes our personal truths, we see the world through those truths so much that we think they're universal. And there's some universal truths about the world, right? War ends in death. It's going to create devastation of local and international economies. It's going to have an environmental impact. Those are truths, but whether or not we are able to fairly judge the past comes from our ability, again, to be able to contextualize the past outside of ourselves. And a good example is the January 6th insurrection, or the attempted insurrection, right? What does someone who's looking back on that event 10 years from now, what do they need to know about what was happening before and during, right, those riots and that insurrection, in order to really understand the moment? We know that there's a lot more to understanding what happened that day than just watching the footage, right? There was a lot that was leading up to that moment. And not just politically, but socially, right? There was the pressure of COVID. There was, this tension, this political tension. There's a lot of history there. And what we see in the Capitol that day is the Confederate flag. And we're going to talk about that. So let me go ahead and get started with this. And I want you to think about your lenses, because as you were reading about the heroification, right, era, or not the heroification era, but the heroification content from the readings, you would have come across these conversations about identity and lenses. And so when we look at the past, we can get our PowerPoint here. The chapter about heroification. Heroification is this process of taking full-bodied people and dwindling them down, right, into these just figures that are unattainable, right? A complex, flawed individual becomes a pious, perfect creature without conflicts, pain, credibility, or human interest. I don't know about you, but that's not the experience that I've had in my life. And so if our historical figures have been heroified into this way, there's no way for us to really truly identify with them and still remain in a sense of reality today that's based upon contextualized history, right? When we take heroified, this erasure of history, we're diminishing the ways in which people can be examples from the past. Lowen talks about the ways in which President Wilson and Helen Keller have been heroified. We know that the story of Helen Keller has often been one about a young girl who overcomes these unimaginable obstacles to break through and communicate and go on to college. And that's it. She just becomes a young adult, and that's the end of her story. And the gift of this story, as we're told by Lowen and reminded, is that the world is constantly a place of wonder, right? And those, no matter how much, and also to appreciate what we owe to those who have helped us along. And those are really important messages. But Helen Keller's story, as it becomes an example in heroification, is not one of empowerment. Really, it's one of achievement. But the empowerment narrative around Keller comes when she comes into her own, right? When she begins to be this autonomous person who's making choices and advocating based upon her experiences. She joins the Socialist Party of Massachusetts in 1909. She praises communism. She's going to join the IWW, which is a union that we'll talk about moving forward, and also the NAACP. And she does this because she understands the importance of disability advocacy in the 20th century. And if we don't learn her story, then we don't get the history of disability advocacy at the turn of the 20th, right? She understood that there was a relationship between class and disability. As Lowen says, through research, she learned that blindness was not distributed randomly throughout the population, but was concentrated in the lower class. And understanding this sentiment, gave rise to her interest in socialism. And yet, once she began to engage in a economic philosophy that challenged the status quo of capitalism, the media turned on her, and no longer did they talk about her and extol her as, a courageous individual. Instead, they talked about her and emphasized her disability. So, understanding why Helen Keller was heroified. One, it's a beautiful story and more moral here about, appreciating what you have and where you come from and what you've overcome. But it's also, right, a story of trying to ensure that we are good patriots, that we are good and loyal citizens. When we are told those larger stories of the past, right? If you're told that Helen Keller began to engage with socialism because she saw the class division as inherently, disparately different in its treatment of people, well, then we might begin to question our own economic system. If we look at the messages of President Woodrow Wilson and how he clearly supported the KKK, right? Celebrated the movie. The movie's escaped my what is it? Birth of a Nation, right? The movie about the justification for the rise of white terror on black men specifically and the protection of white womanhood. And he says the white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern economy. That's what he said. We don't hear that. Why? Because he was our president, right? We don't really talk about his shortcomings, that he was an outspoken white supremacist, that he, went out of his way to eradicate African Americans from federal jobs to the point of requiring that people would apply and also attach a picture of themselves to ensure that people who were being, hired and interviewed were white. He also intervened in Central and South America repeatedly, more times than any other president, right? And why does it matter that we understand who he really was, who Helen Keller really was? Well, Lowen argues that, the heroification has major impacts on society. Our children end up with unrealistic role models and false narratives about the past that lead to people bashing in windows in the Capitol and running through with the terrorist flag that is the Confederate flag. I'm saying this from a person of color who's lived in the South. We don't understand how it is that people die in Charlottesville, when the Confederate flags begin to come down, or the Confederate statues, because, the statues themselves are heroified. Students develop no understanding of causality in history because, to be fair, if we knew what had happened, if we were familiarized with the political environment of Louisiana circa 1873 to 1876, you could see January 6th coming because it's happened before in that state, and you would be able to see what happens next, which is a very unfortunate series of events if we don't start having better conversations and building bridges of understanding between the parties. So let me give you an example here of a heroified story, and think about the lenses in which you walk around with. What kind of identity do you have, and how does it inform the way you look at the world? I come from the South, and when I was teaching in the South, I could use General Lee here. This is a picture of General Lee from the Civil War, the commander of the Confederate Army, right? And in the South, I say, who is he? And everyone's like, oh, he was the general and he was a kindly man. And, the only reason he didn't side with the Union was because at the end of the day, his state went south, went with the Confederacy, and he was a statesman. That's the big thing about who we were prior to the Civil War. We were statespeople more than we were, people who were national. Our patriotism was to our state, not to this nation yet. So if we were to watch one of these videos here, right, we would get that heroified message. The second video is to the biography clip of General Lee, and in it, a historian says, well, General Lee, he didn't believe in secession. He only went because of his state, and he did not support slavery. And I heard that a lot, in the South. Oh, he was a goodly man. He didn't really support slavery. But, when we have these archetypes, we have to question them. And so I do want to stop this presentation for a second because I want you to look at another document. This is a document from the Lee Family Digital Archive, and this is a written testimony of a recorded interview with a Mr. Wesley Norris, who lived on the Custis Plantation, which became the Lee Plantation. This document comes from the Lee Family Digital Archive and was recorded by the National Anti-Slavery Standard on April 14th, 1866, and that is after the Civil War. And you have now these oral historians coming in and interviewing people. And Mr. Wesley Norris says, "My name is Wesley Norris. I was born a slave on the plantation of George Parke Custis, and after the death of Mr. Custis, General Lee, who had been made executor of the estate, assumed control of the slaves in numbers about 70. It was the general impression among the slaves of Mr. Custis that that upon his death, they should be forever free. In fact, this statement had been made to them by Mr. C years before. At his death, we were informed by General Lee, who was married to Mr. Custis's daughter. So he becomes, because women are now the property of their men as well, right? So now General Lee is actually inheriting everything that his wife would have inherited had she not been married when her father died. And, right, I remained with General Lee for 5 years, about 17 months, when my sister Mary, a cousin of ours, and I determined to run away because they had asked him, right, if he would let them free. And he said, no, you have to work for 5 years. So they ran away. We had already reached Westminster in Maryland on our way to the north when we were apprehended and thrown into prison. And then he talks about being in prison, remained in prison for 15 days. And when we were sent back to Arlington, we were immediately taken before General Lee, who demanded the reason why we ran away. We frankly told him that we considered ourselves free. He then told us he would teach us a lesson we would never forget. He then ordered us to the barn, where in his presence we were tied firmly to posts by a Mr. Gwynn, our overseer, who was ordered by General Lee to strip us to the waist and give us 50 lashes each, excepting my sister, who received but 20. We were accordingly stripped to the skin by the overseer, who, however, had sufficient humanity to decline whipping us. According to Dick Williams, a county constable was called in, who gave us the number of lashes ordered. General Lee, in the meantime, stood by and frequently enjoined Williams to lay it on well, an injunction which he did not fail to heed. Not satisfied with simply lacerating our naked flesh, General Lee then ordered the overseer to thoroughly wash our backs with brine, which was done. Now, brine is, a salty, watery mix that you pickle things in. So if you can imagine how it feels when you get vinegar or salt into a little cut on your finger, imagine your back laid open by the lash and then brine poured across your back, how that would feel. So when this historian for the biography channel says that, Lee did not support slavery, but then you see a primary source description of what an enslaved person was dealt at the hands of Lee, it's hard to really believe that Lee was that kindly person. And yet all of these statues remained for him. This Statue in Richmond just came down, and people were running through the Capitol with the Confederate flag. So why does context matter? What does it matter if we are aware of our perspectives and our biases and our lenses? If we can't get a hold of our own and come at this content with some objective, critical thinking, reasoning. I know it's unreasonable to believe that we can ever be fully objective, but if we can't find a way to be mindful of our own biases, we won't see them in the content we're given here. We won't see them in the content that we're given in our day-to-day lives. You do not want to just consume what other people tell you is the truth. You want to be able to think about the facts, the evidence, and come to your own conclusions. And that's what I'm hoping that we learn some in this class. Why does it matter? Because ignoring racist dog whistles send messages that such behavior is not only accepted, but supported. Right? Omitting the truth sends the message that certain groups are inferior and do not deserve recognition. Past wrongs cannot be overcome in silence. So where do we begin? Right? We begin with the earliest colonists. When they first came, they were seeking to engage indigenous peoples and work for them. These were, mid-level farmers who were seeking to really break out and make a name for themselves and to really build their wealth in countries, specifically England, where there was a economic, falling out. There were poor people on the streets, hungry. It was not a very good time, and so the opportunity to go across the sea or the ocean and actually, become an independent farmer was very, very appealing. And of course, indigenous peoples here, resisted. If you lived here and someone came and tried to, enslave you, you can slip away, you can fight, you resist. You can't really enslave people on lands in which they have grown up if you have not grown up on those lands, which is why, slavery is about bringing people from Africa, torturing them, on the way to the ocean, and then forcing them into this physical and psychological, minefield that was the transatlantic experience coming over, and then forcing them into this new paradigm in a new land. That's how you enslave people, right? But the indigenous peoples, they resisted. And so the English colonists were required to bring in their own servants, indentured servants, white Europeans from their countries. And oftentimes these were people that were, actually forced into this. They were stolen off the streets, or they had been arrested for something and it was sold off, right? But no matter what, we know that there were indentured slaves here when the first indentured servants rather, when the first African slaves arrived. And who were the indentured? Again, it was poor people from European cities, and these were people that were abused, as Howard Zinn says, in the 1600s and 1700s, by forced exile, by lures, promises, and lies, by kidnapping, by their urgent need to escape the living conditions of the home country. Poor people wanting to go to America became commodities of profit, and so we know that, on the Belfast, here's a picture of a ship from the same era, 46 of 106 indentured servants, or people coming to become indentured servants, died. 6 of them were eaten by the survivors. Children died of hunger and disease and were thrown overboard. That is very similar in many ways to what, was happening on the second leg of the transatlantic slave. I mean, not to the same severity, but the fact that people were starving, right, dying on these ships and then just being abstractly thrown overboard, that was something that when the African slaves met the indentured servants, they realized that they had something in common, a shared common experience of being at the whip of the master. Indentured servants, right, signed contracts saying that within 5 and 7 years they would be set free and that they would be given this land. But sometimes that time was added on to. There was violence, right? The voyages were hard. People were bought and sold in this situation, and people were beaten. There's these stories of masters trying to control the sexual lives of their servants. I mean, if you had a female servant, you wouldn't want her to get pregnant because she'd be, having to spend her time with her baby rather than dealing with you. So you would tell her she cannot marry, she cannot have sex, she cannot, have any intimacy until her time is done. And the physical punishments were terrible. A mistress was acquitted of cutting off her servant's toes in 1666, which tells me as a legal historian that the servant really had no rights that were being protected. And that is the hook here, because Bacon's rebellion in 1676 institutionalizes slavery. But what happens is you've got these African slaves and these indentured servants, and they're living in this land between the elites and the indigenous. So here is a map of Virginia circa 1676. And on the Atlantic coast was the governor and the elites. And in the middle here were the indentured servants and the slaves. And of course, to the west were the indigenous peoples who were being forced off their lands, and they were fighting, and they would come and they would, engage in warfare with these Europeans and these Africans, and the Africans and the Europeans were appealing to the higher class to give them, the upper class to give them weapons, to bring out troops to protect them. And it was falling on ears that were just denying it. And so they organized a rebellion. They created a Declaration of the People. Does that sound familiar? In 1676, charging the governor of unjust taxes, of favorites being put into high positions, monopolies on fur trades, no protection for Western farmers. And so 400 people in an integrated group, black and white, marched. They marched to kill the governor. And this insurrection was put down. And as Howard Zinn says, only one fear was greater than the fear of black rebellion in new colonies. That was the fear that discontented whites would join black slaves to overthrow the existing order. And so after this battle, after this insurrection, the elites put in a new type of law. What made Bacon's rebellion especially fearsome for the rules of Virginia was that black slaves and white servants joined forces, Howard Zinn says. And so what we see after this is the creation of laws that separated people. So if you had come from, Europe, you would be considered an indentured servant, and now you could take your master to court if he or she treated you unfairly. You would be sure to have a voice in court. You would be insured land, and you'd be insured clothing, right? But if you came from an unchristian country or place like Africa, you were perpetually a slave, and you had no voice in government, and you would never be free. And what that ultimately did was it took a group of people who had a shared common experience, and it created a disjointment, so that these indentured servants who would be free one day, they really did not have it much better than the black slaves, but they now had a loyalty to the upper white elites because they had a little bit of privilege, just a little bit. And so instead of now seeing themselves aligned with the people who were most like them, instead they see themselves aligned with the people who looked most like them. Howard Zinn, in the first chapter of A People's History, he talks about the framework of his book. It's a sad, hard story. But I come back to this statement over and over, this quote that he has in the first chapter. He says, "My point is not to grieve for the victims and denounce the executioners. Those tears that anger cast into the past deplete our moral energy for the present, and the lines are not always clear. In the long run, the oppressor is also the victim. In the short run, the victims themselves, desperate and tainted with the culture that oppresses them, turn on other victims." And that's what I see when I see my fellow Southerners with their Confederate flags today. I see the perpetuation of this tool of division, largely based on racist rhetoric and misinformation about the past. Now, I'm going to stop there in our taking a look back for a moment, and just give us a chance to kind of reflect on what we've gone over so far. Sorry about that. So I'll stop and finish this one segment and then come back for the next part.